Zhongli, the CEO of Geo, was controversially weak on release, but quickly became irreplaceable before slowly falling into irrelevancy. We will uncover why Zhongli has fallen out of the meta, starting with his chaotic release, his rise to the top, and finally the gradual downfall. Act 1. The release. Flashback to 2020 and the Geo Archon himself was about to drop after one of the most successful game launches in history. Needless to say, expectations were sky high when the hype still lingers after his appearance in the Archon quest. Many fans highly admire his character design and VA, building up even more hype on social media prior to his banner. On top of everything, the previously released Animal Archon, Venti, just had a dominant debut in the previous patch, so the community was anticipating nothing less than another S-tier Archon. However, calling Zhongli's banner release a disaster is an absolute understatement, when countless players pulled him with excitement only to receive underwhelming results. Within days of his release, the community was filled with posts expressing disappointment, such as this one that tried to explain everything wrong with Zhongli, outlining how all his skills are useless. Specifically, his base damage is one of the worst in the game. His normal attack percent is really weak compared to Shangling, that's a 4-star. His E generate energy in a weird interval, and it buffs defense, which not many characters at the time could utilize well, aside from Noelle. This is just one of the few reasons that they include in this very long post. This encapsulates the community sentiment that Zhongli's power level was inexcusable for his status, because Zhongli, as the Geo Archon Morax, was portrayed in Tevat's lore as an almighty god of war. However, fans felt that the actual gameplay of Zhongli did not live up to that name. In the Chinese community, things were even more serious, as Li Ye is inspired by China, so you can imagine how massive the outrage was in the Chinese community after witnessing their Archon fall short, while Venti was so game-breaking. One person even noted that miHoYo intentionally weakens the Archon that represents Li Ye is unpatriotic. However, these posts were removed immediately afterwards. Because of the seriousness of the situation, miHoYo was very quick to acknowledge the situation. In only 6 days after Zhongli's debut, on December 7, 2020, they issued an official announcement. However, they reiterated that Zhongli was in a balanced state. So not only that the developers did not promise a buff, instead they explained that Zhongli was designed as a support character. They also emphasized that his skill has effective absorption and cover without relying on any other equipment, while his burst exerts effective control over groups of enemy without relying on elemental reactions or equipment bonuses. And from a design standpoint, these two features enable Zhongli to fulfill his role as a support character, effectively improving Traveler's survival capabilities. In short, miHoYo argued that Zhongli was performing as intended, a character that focused on defense and utility rather than damage. However, his signature weapon, Vortex Vanquisher, is an offensive weapon with attack percentage as a secondary stat. So actually, from a design standpoint, miHoYo is actually conflicting themselves, and the confusion experienced by the player base was completely understandable. You have to remember that this was a time where the game was very new, and some people even thought that Chi-Chi was better than Bennett. So it goes without saying that people couldn't truly grasp Zhongli's true power, especially when the game displays him in such a manner that resembles a DPS. In essence, the community felt miHoYo's explanation represented a complete disconnect with the player base. Faced with the ongoing backlash, miHoYo backtracked fairly quickly. In just under 2 weeks from the first notice, on December 19, 2020, they published an official announcement. Specifically, miHoYo outlined plan adjustments to Zhongli. The buff news had a dramatic positive effect on the community sentiment and started spreading like wildfire. However, there were some that were frustrated that the buff announcement came just 3 days before his banner was over, because now they have FOMO of missing out on him. Nonetheless, most players were happy that Zhongli was getting fixed, and that was the key turning point in the Zhongli saga. Act 2. The Rise. Genshin Impact version 1.3 delivered the promised Zhongli buffs, and the improvements were substantial. Specifically, all of Zhongli's damage now scales with his max HP. In practical terms, this meant players could build Zhongli on high HP to maximize his shield, while still being able to deal respectable damage through his normal attack and burst. On top of that, his skill was changed to become the almighty shield that we know today. Perhaps more importantly though, a new debuff mechanic was added to his skill, where it shreds all elemental and physical resistances by 20%. This was absolutely game-changing, because to this day, he is still the only character that can provide a universal shred with a single ability. But that wasn't even the end of all the buffs, because Geo Shields in general was changed to absorb 150% damage from all elements and physical damage, where originally they were only 250% effective against Geo, making Geo Shields much more flexible. And the cherry on top of everything was the rework of Geo Resonance. Before, it only increased attack by 15% to shield the characters, versus now, where not only only does it increase shield strength by 15%, but also give a 15% damage increase while reducing geo resistances by 20%. This was a direct buff for Zhongli and geo teams in general. The difference in Zhongli's performance was immediately felt. Practically overnight, Zhongli went from one of the worst 5 stars to one of the game's best supports. Many are now claiming that he's too useful, to the point that many want 2 of him for Abyss. Players share clips of them literally not take any damage while shielded by Zhongli, or deal a huge burst damage, and yes, back then this was considered to be massive damage. Anyways, all Zhongli havers all shared the sentiment that he almost makes you forget how to dodge. It was even joked that Zhongli took one for the team and faked being weak to get geo buff. One thing was clear, Zhongli was no longer a controversial character in terms of power. After the buffs, Zhongli's usage rate skyrocketed in version 1.4, tallying an impressive 97% usage rate. This surge in usage rate was due to him being the best in slot support for 2 of the best DPSs at the time, Ganyu and Hu Tao. For Ganyu, Zhongli's shield was vital to provide the interruption immunity that she needs for her charge shot. His shield also allows for more offensive teammates like Bennett and Shangling, while still providing the crucial 20% pyro and cryo shred. As for Hu Tao, the double geo core with Xingqiu and Albedo proves to be impeccable in single target. It can even be argued that Zhongli's shield actually increases Hu Tao's damage output because she can focus on performing her optimal combos instead of worrying about dodging. And the added 15% damage from geo resonance is also appreciated. But it gets even better because in version 1.5, Zhongli received his first rerun banner along with a second story quest, which delved further into his past and personality, further increasing his popularity. But the true meta highlight of the patch was the release of the Tenacity of the Millilith artifact set, because it just synergizes perfectly with his kit. When practically this allows Zhongli to have a full uptime on a 20% team-wide attack buff. Oh, and it also gives a 20% HP and 30% shield strength, so your shield can be even thicker. It was like this artifact set was custom made just for Zhongli, further solidifying his place as the best support. And there was a direct reflection when examining his Abyss usage rate, consistently staying at the top in version 1 of Genshin. At this point, Zhongli's shield trivialized difficult content and made players wonder, how did we ever live without Zhongli? Fast forward to the arrival of Inazuma. Zhongli consistently found himself new teammates with Yoimiya in 2.0, then in 2.3 he got his most synergistic teammate in the name of Ito. Contrary to how people see him nowadays, Ito was a powerhouse back when he was released in 2.3, as he was the strongest Geo DPS, taking full advantage of Goro's 40% crit damage buff. But it is Zhongli who is the core component of the Mono Geo team archetype, thanks to his unbreakable shield. This was a team that has the extreme comfort from Zhongli, while still being easy to play and dish out massive damage. Then a couple versions later in 2.7, one of the best characters was released in the name of Yelan. She, alongside with Xingqiu, formed the strongest core at the time, the double hydro core, that deal massive off-field damage. And this further benefited no other than Zhongli, with the added HP from hydro resonance, paving the way for the strongest single target team with Hu Tao, replacing Albedo in the double geo core. So up until now, Zhongli has always found himself as the best in slot option amongst top DPS options. Hoyoverse even tried to negate Zhongli's prowess by specifically adding anti-shield enemies like the Rift Hound that ignores shield completely and apply a bleed effect on hit. However, that was all for naught, because Zhongli still found himself amongst the top units in the region, evident by his strong Abyss performance. However, soon this will no longer be the case. Act 3, The Fall. The introduction of Sumeru brings Dendro, a completely new element that has absolutely no interaction with Geo. Many of the new teams favor Dendro reactions, with Tignari in a quick swap quicken team that has no shielders. Nilou was played exclusively in Bloom teams because of how her passive works. Then 3.2 saw the release of the Archon of the region, Nahida, who quickly redefined the meta to a double Hydro Hyper Bloom team that can seemingly clear every content, because although it specializes in single target damage, their raw damage was so high that they don't have much trouble in AoE either. This, along with the simplicity of the comp, diminishes the need for a defensive option, when the only thing they have to do is to normal attack with Nahida. And in case more comfort is needed, Cookie is also available to sustain the team sufficiently. So Zhongli, for the first time ever, didn't find himself in the very best team. That didn't change much with Wanderer's release in 3.3, because his damage was even better than Zhongli's old teammates like Hu Tao and Ganyu. However, Wanderers is a character that will appreciate Zhongli, but even in such a case, there are still competitions, because Wanderer's hypercarry team always feature Bennett and Farozan, and with Farozan already providing 30% animal shred, Zhongli's shred faces diminishing return. Also, as the flex slot, Thoma was available as a fantastic defensive option. Although his shield isn't as strong as Zhongli, it is way more than sufficient enough to handle most contents at the time. On top of that, Thoma provides Pyro Resonance with Bennett, and at C6 he also gives 15% charge attack and normal attack damage bonus. So even when Zhongli was a viable option, he still faced fierce competition, whereas that was never the case back in the days where he was always the sole best in slot. Subsequent Sumeru releases were no different, as Alhaitham only further strengthened Quick Bloom teams, while Baiju provided more comfort for Aggravate and Nulu teams. Throughout the entire region of Sumeru, Zhongli did not impact the meta in the slightest, but that doesn't mean that he was bad, because some very aggressive enemies were added to the Spiral Abyss, and Zhongli once again proved that he was unbreakable. And despite Hoyoverse adding anti-shield enemies like the Black Serpent that get special effects when they hit a shielded character, Zhongli still managed to maintain his high usage rate throughout the region of Sumeru. Then comes Fontaine, where Zhongli had a slight resurgence by first slotting in as a flex slot in the Mono Pyro Lini team, because some prefer him over Kazuha for the comfort that he provides. Then in 4.1, Neuvillette was released as the strongest character at the time, and Zhongli once again found himself as a useful teammate, but this was only because Neuvillette is very flexible and didn't have his best in slot team yet, evident by the use of Child purely to buff Neuvillette's normal attack talent and provide Hydro Resonance. So perhaps more significantly was the release of Navia, because Ito has long been phased out of the meta by this point, and Zhongli was of course monumental for Navia. Although Navia wasn't particularly outstanding, she gave the spotlight back to Geo with Abyss cycles that feature enemies with massive Geo shields. In particular, the Legatus Golem heavily spiked Zhongli's usage rate when he alone can break almost half of his shield with a simple skill and burst. Subsequently was the release of Geori in 4.5 and Power Creep in Albedo to form a new Geo core with Zhongli. Although this is flexible and very comfortable, it didn't see much play because Shiori's power level wasn't up to par with the damage profile at the time. In general, it's just hard for Geo Resonance to compete with other resonances, despite being very good itself, because it is not that beneficial to slot in two characters just to enable a resonance. Normally, the best value comes from Hydro and Pyro Resonance, because key members of the team are already of that element. These characters are already integral to the team that they're in, so their resonance is just a much appreciated add-on benefit. While Zhongli is good enough himself, slotting in an extra Geo character just isn't worth it because it doesn't enable any reactions. The rather dire situation didn't improve much with the release of heavy hitters like Arlecchino and Cloren, as neither used Zhongli in their best teams. Although it is worth mentioning that he can be played in these teams, he just isn't the best in slot option with the inflation of the Abyss HP, so teams prefer raw damage rather than defensive utility. Then towards the tail end of Fontaine was Emily, a character that foreshadowed the release of Natlan, a region that took power creeping to the next level, and this was where Zhongli truly fell out of the meta, as he found himself used less and less. Kanish doesn't really use him at all because he's so mobile, while Mualani did use him for a brief period, before Shilonen quickly took back the spot by actually providing more elemental shred, while also providing 40% damage bonus from Scroll, and all while having healing as a defensive option. To make matters worse, she also directly replaced Zhongli in Neuvillette and Navia's teams, becoming the best in slot there as well. Things don't really look up from here with the release of Chaska, who does not work with Geo at all, and the killer patch 5.3 came with the release of Mavuika and Sitlali, taking the DPS ceiling of C0 characters to the next level. Mavuika is so powerful that she can wipe out most of the enemies before they even have the chance to touch her. Worst of all, Sitlali has major overlaps with Zhongli, because she is also a shielder, albeit a much weaker one, but in return, she's able to also shred Pyro and Hydro by the same 20%, while also providing 40% damage bonus from Scroll. But Sitlali's biggest advantage is her being cryo and her decently fast application, enabling even characters like the Luke and Gaming to shine in a forward melt team. It is also noteworthy to mention Lan Yang's release, because she in certain situations can actually have a bigger shield than Zhongli. However, this is entirely situational because she needs to infuse the exact same element as the enemy's attack. Even then, her shield has a much lower uptime, so Zhongli's shield was never power crept, unlike how the community perceived it at the time. But further releases of powerful characters like Escoffier, Skirk, and Veressa further obsolete Zhongli, because now the meta just demands more from each character. This means that a support has to be able to consolidate multiple roles, like Escoffier providing team-wide healing, while also giving a 55% shred to Cryo and Hydro, and Bennett, who also provides the highest attack buff in the game while also healing the active character. Another example of this is the recently released character in Effa. She not only provides a shield for comfort, but she also dishes out decent damage while enabling a new reaction, Luna Charge, for the entire party. Zhongli being a 1.1 character is in a massive disadvantage when the offensive utilities that he provides can no longer be compared to modern supports. And the last time Zhongli has any synergy with a character's release was Navia, which was over a year ago, and she wasn't particularly meta-defining either. Zhongli used to be a powerhouse who was a part of all the meta teams, but now there isn't a single meta team that uses him, and that is reflective in his usage rate slipping into oblivion at close to 10% compared to his peak of nearly 100%. This decline only occurred because of the perfect storm that Hoyoverse cooked up. Nowadays, the Abyss face an exponential HP inflation that has no sign of slowing down, favoring more damage rather than defensive utility. Stygian Onslaught took this to another level, requiring teams to be built optimally for damage for any hopes of clearing higher level difficulties. Also, at this point in the game, many are more skilled, so they can rely more on dodging to output more damage. And on top of everything, the final nail in the coffin is Hoyoverse's design choice. Characters nowadays have strong built-in interruption resistances, like Skirk and Mafuika, so there isn't really a need for a shield because oftentimes they are played with a healer that has role consolidation like Bennett or a Scoffier. This is in complete contrast to a time where a shield is a must for a character to even properly function, like when Ganyu or Hu Tao was released. But does this mean that Zhongli is bad now? He definitely isn't, because he's still the best shielder in the game. But it's just that the meta currently isn't favoring shielders in general, and Zhongli, as the CEO of all shielders, took the biggest hit. However, if Hoyo decides to introduce very aggressive enemies, like an upgraded version of the Consecrated Beasts, or bosses that favor Geo like the Legatus Golem, then we will likely to see him in the forefront of Genshin once more. But let me know what you guys think of Zhongli. Do you think there will ever be a time where he takes over the meta again? Anyways, that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.